You share my go and use it. I'm seeing this. I need to rush out of town.
That's your WhatsApp. You have WhatsApp.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Here's your WhatsApp. My WhatsApp.
This was a 3 months.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, sir. Enjoy the next session.
Okay, you want to go? I can't go somewhere. Oh,
Sorry, sir.
yeah, we're good. We're good. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Hello, Catherine.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Apologies for starting a little bit behind schedule. You can come and sit here so that they can see us in one view, right? Yeah. So we will be starting in a few seconds. Just getting all the PowerPoints ready from this end. Oh, Uneku Friday was here, but I think maybe he's having network issues. I believe he will be joining us again soon.
I have some slides that I to share, but I can just share them from my screen if that's okay. I don't.
Yes, please. Yes, it's okay. You can do that from your end.
Okay, great. Hi, Tim. Hi, everybody.
And you see your program? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so it's caption always correct. First, yeah. So welcome everyone to this panel. This is the second part of the panel, and it's about Africanizing animals, agency, modernity, and colonial non-humans in history. And the thinking behind the composition of the panel was really that it would be, a conference about African identities may be quite incomplete if we didn't talk about debates around animals, if we didn't center animals in the discourses. So this is why this panel has been constituted, and I thank everyone who has opted to be a part of this panel. And without taking a lot of time, I would just ask that we jump right into the presentations. We would be taking the presentations in the order that they appear on the program, barring any other circumstances that may come up, because we are still expecting Uneku Friday to join us. I mean, he's been here. Maybe he will be back with us shortly. So, but we have the first presenter here in the person of Professor Catherine Baxter. And I would like to bring her on stage. Our presentation is on animal mobilities at the border, livestock and state making in British Somaliland Protectorate. Just to give you a brief bio of Professor Catherine Baxter before I call her to make a presentation. 1 second, my device is acting up, but I think yeah. 1 second, please.
I'm happy to introduce myself if that's easier.
Okay, you can take it over, please.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but also thank you so much for organising this really fantastic set of papers over yesterday and today. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join yesterday, but it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be joining you on this important topic. So my paper is part of early research coming out of a project funded by the British Academy with colleagues in India. We're developing work in Somaliland now as well, on desert and arid regions, and the animal side of things is something which I'm focusing on. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, here we go. Let's see. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing that slideshow, and I'll start.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So In the 1880s and 1890s, the Somali region of East Africa was carved up between multiple imperial forces, Britain, Ethiopia, France, and Italy. The British Somaliland Protectorate, as it became known, was established in 1887. Agreements demarcating its borders with its Ethiopian, French, and Italian neighbours were not negotiated, however, until the 1890s and were not fully mapped topographically until the 20th century. And importantly, those 1890s treaties and later 20th century ones argued that these borders should permit a level of unchecked mobility across them to accommodate the nomadic movement of pastoralists. At first glance, this accommodation might seem to erase some of the force of the protectorate's borders. At the same time, though, the cross-border movement of Somali pastoralists were often tied to cross-border clan affiliations, such as the Dulbahante, who crossed the Italian border, and the Gadabursi, who worked across and moved across the Ethiopian border. And these clan relationships likewise blurred state borders by positing alternative forms of legal affiliation and identity that were not defined by state cartographies. In this paper, I want to argue that this accommodation of movement actually became the grounds for a variety of bordering practices that emerged from animal and pastoralist mobility. I'm going to look at 3 examples of how animal movement made tangible the protectorate's borders. Firstly, quarantine measures that the British established at the protectorate's borders in an attempt to manage animal disease in nomadic herds. Secondly, cross-border livestock raids undertaken by Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan and his followers during his dervish insurgency against colonial rule. And lastly, the movement for unification of Somali peoples across colonially imposed borders following independence. So let's start with quarantine and, oops, pressing the wrong button. Let's see. Okay. Oh, hang on a second. Oh. Well, I shall come to, it looks like I've not got the right slide for quarantine, but I shall just read it out and then we'll get to livestock raids in a wee bit. So animal husbandry was of vital importance to British interests in the protectorate at the point of colonisation. And at the point of colonisation, pastoralism was the predominant way of life, especially in the interior of the region. While the colonial administration attempted at various points to introduce other industries, agricultural and otherwise, by and large, the British did not seek to undo the dominance of pastoralism for Somalis. Initially, animal husbandry was the responsibility of the civil administration, while military animal husbandry was the responsibility of the individual military divisions. But in 1924, a veterinary department was formed which supported both branches for animal management in the protectorate and supplied regular reports to the governor, which in turn were shared with the Colonial Office. And these reports recount the veterinary officer's attempts to introduce various European veterinary practices, such as sheep dipping, and they attest to the various levels of interest that individual officers took in Somali veterinary and animal husbandry knowledge and practice. Given the nomadic movement of livestock within and beyond the protectorate, as opposed to enclosed grazing, a key area of concern for the officers was contagious disease. And throughout the 1920s, the officers' reports evidence a range of actions taken to address contagious disease that threatened the quality and resilience of herds. Programs of vaccination were rolled out with varying levels of pastoralist resistance and engagement. And in addition, quarantine stations were set up on the Italian and Ethiopian borders to limit contagion being brought into the protectorate. So in 1926, the veterinary officer claimed in his report that the greater rates of disease in the west of the protectorate, as opposed to the east, were a result of the intermixing on grazing grounds along the Abyssinian, that means the Ethiopian border, with diseased animals belonging to the Abyssinian tribes. As a consequence, he suggests to the Eastern pastoralists who are looking to increase stock numbers that they quarantine any purchases for a short period of 14 days and clear them of ticks. He notes it is by no means a difficult business, and if there was likely to be importation of any numbers of camels, a quarantine station on the borderline appears to me not quite impractical, though somewhat idealistic. However, by the 1930s, such quarantine stations, which were also used to dispense vaccines, had become a regular occurrence along the border. In December 1933, the veterinary officer reported on their attempts to manage rinderpest. There's been an increase in the number of herds affected, and it has been necessary to open a new quarantine. In the Hargeisa area, the increase of numbers is considerable, owing to tribes having returned to this side of the border. There has been considerable opposition to the quarantine, as there always is among certain tribes, but the matter is being handled satisfactorily. Double inoculation on payment continues, and though the disease is well under control, more could be done if there was not the continued opposition on the part of the wadads or priests. And later in the same report, he records a meeting with the Director of Veterinary Services in Ethiopia. So in each of these reports, the veterinary officer proposes or implements practices, different veterinary practices that activate the otherwise nebulous border with Ethiopia by regulating not only the movement of animals, but also their care. Moreover, the repeated assertions that it is in Ethiopia that contagion arises and from which it spreads posits a political border that is characterized by disease. Okay, livestock raids, and I'm on the right slide now. In 1907, we encounter in the archives a set of correspondence relating to the displacement of members of the Ria Mahad following raids by the Alighieri, who were part of the Dulbahante clan, which was the Said's clan. The Ria Mahad, part of the Majeerteen clan, had primarily resided nomadically within Italian Somaliland. But in late August, a small delegation petitioned the assistant political officer in British Somaliland and Barrow, requesting permission to become subjects of the British administration and to remain within British borders. So these two clans, the Majeerteen and the Dulbahante, had for some time conducted raids against each other along this Italian-British border. And they were primarily of livestock, and hundreds of head could be looted in an individual raid. And these were used often to reward followers, for example, of the Said, and pay lavish bride prices for the various multiple political marriages that he sought to contract in a kind of part of his larger kind of politics across the border. In the same period, the Said used poetry as a tool of diplomacy and political provocation to further his cause. As well as celebrating successful raids, his poems chide rival clans for their submission to British and Ethiopian, that is to say, Christian rule. So, for example, he boasts, "Defeated the English now bring us tributes, from Bulgar come the rich tokens of their submission, and for the Italians, behold, they come as dervish allies." In return, one of his great poetic rivals, Ali Jamal Khabil, mocked the Said as an Italian infidel. When the Ria Mahad delegation first arrived at Barrow, they numbered about 600, but within a month, there were roughly 2,000 displaced seeking refuge. Moreover, as they moved to Barrow, they were then being raided again within British Somaliland. The acting commissioner, let's see if I have this quotation for you. Yes, I won't read all of it, but I'll pop it up there for you. So the acting commissioner notes that they're reduced to the verge of starvation owing to the loss of flocks on which they were dependent, and talks about the fact that they have been raided in these ways. The British response to the delegation was to refuse the Ria Mahad long-term refuge and rather to send them on to Aden to present their petition to the Italian consul. And the rationale for this was to avoid providing the Said with new cause to attack the British by taking up the cause of this rival tribe. What interests me in this example is how, once again, the movement of animals, both in search of safe grazing by crossing over into British Somaliland and through livestock raids, activates keen attention to political borders. So the border agreements between the Protectorate and its neighbours provided for pastoral mobility. So it's not the livestock movement per se that activates this bordering practice, but rather the intersection of animal mobilities with securitization that prompts the Real Mahad to invoke the protection of political borders, and also the British administration to invoke the distinctions of political subjectivity that the borders demarcated. At the same time, the poetry of the Said and his contemporaries illustrates how livestock raids were used to entice and enforce other kinds of political security that were drawn up along lines of clan allegiance that crossed the colonial borders established by the Italians, British, French, and Ethiopians. Nonetheless, those same colonial powers were invoked by the Said and his contemporaries in their poetry in the process of defining and distinguishing clan affiliation. And the Rear Mahad's appeal to the acting commissioner indicates how local populations sought to use the political borders established by the colonial powers to increase their own security. So I've got one final example, quite a quick one here, on post-colonial poetry. So following independence in the 1960s, British Somaliland united with the Trust Territory of Somaliland, which was former Italian Somaliland. But many hoped for larger unification with the Somali-inhabited northern frontier district of Kenya, French Djibouti, and Somali-inhabited regions of Ethiopia. In 1963, armed resistance broke out in one of the Somali regions of Ethiopia, and poets and singers took to the airwaves to champion the cause of Somali nationalism and unification across the borders of the Republic. And those borders of the Republic were ones imposed by the old colonial powers. So interestingly, a number of these songs and poems use pastoralism metaphorically and practically to characterize the impact of the colonial imposed borders that continued to divide Somalis from each other following independence. So one singer asks, for example, seeing the partitioning of Somalis and the single family and families being invaded and murdered every day, was I wrong to be discontented and mad from anger like a man who has lost all his camels, and thus to prepare for trouble and damage? And in another poem, broadcast on Mogadishu radio in August 1963, Arais Isa observes, once we were animals and divided by enemies who separated us and drew boundaries between us and told us that the Somalis on the other side had crossed to our side of the border and who advised us to fight them back. Not knowing that he, the enemy, wanted our destruction, we used to march in the darkness, attack our brothers and loot the stock, only to be arrested by him who claimed he was the judge of the land and did not want looted stock to cross to his side of the border. These enemies then collected the looted stock only to sell it and pour the money into their pockets. This poem seems to me to summarize the inherent contradictions of bordering practices that emerged through the colonial securitization of animal mobilities in the region. So these brief examples demonstrate some of the ways that I'm encountering a nexus between animal mobility and political borders in the colonial archives of the British Somaliland Protectorate, and also in colonial and post-colonial era Somali poetry. What they illustrate is the limit points and contradictions inherent in geopolitical approaches for governing the arid and semi-arid regions in which the British established the Protectorate. Moreover, by focusing on livestock, the nexus around which Somali economies and cultures had evolved, we can trace alternative models of statehood that operated somewhat differently from, even as they interacted with, colonial state models that relied on geopolitical bordering practices for their definition. The power of those cross-border models of statehood are activated following independence in the poetry and song of wider Somali liberation, not least through the invocation of how colonial bordering practices operated through the securitization of animal mobilities. Thank you very much.
So I will ask that we So I will ask that we put our questions on hold until the end of four rounds of presentations. And now I will call on Nepo Friday, who is from the Kogi State University, to present his paper on the title, Interrupted Intermediaries, Colonial Policies and the Disconnection of the Spirit World from Healing Gala. No, you have to unmute, please. You have. Yeah, there you go. So,
good morning, everyone.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, we can hear you.
I am Itudu Nepo Friday, and I am glad to present about the Igala people. Hello?
Yes,
Hello,
we can
I am
hear
glad to present about the Igala people and the impact of colonialism on the healing traditions of the people. The Igala people are located in the old Kaba province, the Eastern Division, at the heart of Nigeria, where the River Niger and Benue embraces. They have a very rich history and culture, deeply connected with the spirit world. And traditional healing play a great part in the life of the people. And often animals serve as intermediaries between the spiritual world and the people. And that is because in Igala, just like every other African society, illnesses and the healing practices are decided by the causes. For instance, we have the natural cause of diseases, preternatural, and the mystical causes. The natural, normally cured by the use of herbs. Then the preternatural and the mystical, which is caused by either enemy or the ancestral spirit, are normally cured by the diviners, which often use animals as intermediaries to connect the spiritual world and the physical world. So the essence of this paper is to interrogate the impact of colonialism on the healing practice of the people. So in carrying out this research, I employed critical ethnographical approach informed by the post-colonial theory. So using a semi-structured interview, I got information from elders, healers, and traditional chiefs, alongside with archival documents to actually understand the impact of colonialism on the healing traditions of the people. So through the course of my research, I understand that the colonial government strategies manifested in several ways. Firstly was the criminalization, a situation whereby the colonial government tried to criminalize the traditional healing process of the people. And in this particular instance, the Collective Punishment Ordinance of 1948, chapter 34, section 3, come into play. They also use medicalization, a process whereby they promote their own medical practice, then try to push our own medical practice to the fringe. They also use demonization. This is a process whereby they try to create the impression that the traditional medical practice is savage and also evil. So through this process, they don't only try to like hinder the practice of these rituals, they also try to disconnect the relationship between the significance of animals in the traditional healing process of the Igalas. For instance, these practices comes in the form of either individual worship, in the case of mystical causation and curation, of either individual worship, community worship, or a big celebration in the capital of the kingdom in Ida. And in this case, the Ocho festival comes into play. This is a festival, for instance, where the people, before the beginning of every farming and hunting festival, or hunting season, they carry out this festival to provoke the ancestral spirit, the spirit of the ancestors, to guide them and to protect against disease, thereby promoting bumper harvest. This has been with the people for long and is strongly believed. So the colonial government, seeing this as an I don't criminalizing, I don't really get. The people see it as a way of like a stamp on their growth. So I got to realize in the process of my research that the people, through ethnographic research and ethnographic information and archival documents, the proscribing and the banning of the Ocho Festival in 1956 was not just because it was fetish and savage as it was portrayed, because even in England as at that time, as Binnat and Manning put, their own hunting and farming festival was even brutal and prolonged, but they romanticized this process as an allied sport. So in my analysis, I try to look at even the use of ritual of sacrifice in the Bible, in the Quran. So I come to realize that it was a ploy to promote Western practice as against traditional healing. So in as much as this was going on, the people did not just stay aloof and watch, they also responded. And one of the events that actually prompted the people's response was the chickenpox epidemic of 1967. This actually happened a year after the banning of the Ocho Festival. So the people believe that it was actually caused by the banning of the festival and the Ocho celebration that did not happen in that year. So then the new Atta held secret meeting with his people, then decentralized the celebration rather than being in the center of the kingdom like Ida. It was decentralized. They integrated the special Ocho prayers to the Egorego and the Ibegu festival. That is the ancestral worship done by individual and the ones done in the various communities. And there is no way these festivals are carried out without the use of animals. Animals were the intermediaries between the spiritual world and the physical world. And it's the reason why the reason the colonial government gave for banning the Ocho Festival was cruelty to animals. And as I said, banning Binnat and Manning, Ocho, through their work on hunting and other hunting games in England, as at that point when the ritual was banned, their own hunting process was even prolonged, cruel, but was romanticized. So in all, this work from my finding. Hello?
Yeah, we are too.
So the work from my findings actually shows that the colonial government at that time was actually to promote Western medicine and diminish traditional practice. And this work contributes immensely to the current debate on the impact of colonial medicine on colonialism and on traditional medicine in Africa. Although the research is still ongoing, but this is my findings, and I would have shown some of the archival information, but when I checked the file of Atta of Igala, the then Atta that was almost deposed before he chose suicide, the period when the Ocho festival was banned, the file was empty. So thank you for now.
Thank you very much, Level Friday, for your presentation. So we already have two presentations that talk about animal diseases in relation, on one hand, with modern practices, and on the other hand, with healing systems, either colonial science or ethno-veterinary medicine. So now we will be moving on to Oluwapo Fifebo Sunday's presentation on, it is titled Rehumanizing the Yoruba Ethology of Goats. Oluwapo is a faculty member at Adekunle Ajashi University, and I would ask her to take it from.
Thank you very much. I'm Oluwapo from Adekunle Ajashi University, and my area of interest is environmental philosophy, particularly human and nature interaction. So today I'm looking at rehumanizing the Yoruba ethology of goats. What I intend to do is to re-examine how Yoruba people perceive the goat, animal perception. So in Yoruba folklores, Yoruba literatures, there are rich and instructive beliefs about animals, just like the other presenter said, spirituality, healing, and all of that. However, despite this, many people still conceive the goat in a negative perspective, particularly in Yoruba ethology. And by ethology, I mean the study of the behavior of animals. Yoruba ethology of goats have been derived from the behavior of goats in Yoruba society. And in this ethology, goats are often associated with negative characteristics like incorrigibility, stubbornness, headstrongness, resistance to control, and so on. So what I propose to do is to argue that animals are important members of the environment and social structure in Africa. And as a more than human entity, animals and humans are beneficial to each other. In Yoruba society, and goats are kept for their culinary and economic values. So it means that they are cherished for their instrumental values, while the perception of the goat remains largely negative. So the goat is one of the animals that is domesticated. We have the male goats, we have the female, we have the male goats, we have the female goats, and they come in different colors. The male goat is associated with a distinct odor, such that Yoruba people say, Obukode, Orunde. When the e-goats arise, the smell arise, that it is the odor of the goat that announces its arrival. And also in Yoruba philosophy, they believe that these goats have spiritual benefits. For those who are spiritually knowledgeable, they know how to make use of certain parts of the goat for spiritual rituals and practices. However, the epistemology of the goat in Yoruba society is largely negative. And I intend to show that beyond the negative nuances, there are positive values that we can derive from the goat, that we can use to communicate appropriate moral behaviors as well. That is, beyond the instrumental value, goats should be valued for their intrinsic values. And we have this particular folklore that is common, children recite it in school. Ewúrẹ́ jẹ́ ẹran ilé. The goat is maybe we can even sing it together. Ewúrẹ́ jẹ́ ẹran ilé tó máa ń jìyà púpọ̀ nítorí àìgbọ́ràn rẹ̀. tí wọ́n bá na ewúrẹ́, àgbètí méjì pépé, kó lójú tó ṣẹpẹ́, á tún padà síbi tí ó ti jìyà lẹ́ẹ̀kan. Ẹ̀yin ọmọdé ẹ gbọ́, ẹ má ṣe bí ewúrẹ́, ẹran aláìgbọràn. Now, and that's the English translation there. From the above, we can begin to distill the Yoruba epistemology of the goat. The first line denotes that the goat is a domestic animal, one that can cohabit with humans. It indicates that the goat is capable of human-animal relation, that is cohabitation and interaction. While the second line to the last line denotes a negative characteristic of the goat as an animal that suffers a lot of punishment because of his stubbornness and incorrigibility. Now you see brutality towards animal. The animal does not yield to correction, and so it is flogged severally, and it goes back to do what it has done for which it was flogged in the first place. And at the end of this folklore, Yoruba people use it to communicate moral behaviors to children, that children, listen, don't be like the goat. Now, the song about the goat is intended to make law-abiding citizens out of children, with the hope that when one is law-abiding, crime, violence, punishment would reduce in the society. And to be honest, this is desirable. This is desirable. In an objective sense, the behavior of the goat is as described in the folklores, and it can even be more depending on how stubborn the goat is. The goat actually possesses all of these negative attributes. But why does the goat possess these negative attributes? Scholars have argued that animals are capable of social learnings from humans. So for me, it is high time we began to rethink our ethology of the goat, expanding it to foster a more interconnected relationship. The goat is a special animal that desires close and knitted interaction with humans. Anyone who rears goats must have time to develop relationship with goats. And I have seen my mother rear goats, train us with goats. Whenever the goat arrives in our home, she welcomes the goat by feeding the goat on the tip of her wrapper, on the tip of her dress. Now, what she tells us is that when she feeds the goat on the tip of her own dress, the goat would not stray away. The goat would feel attached to her. And then she names the goat. We have Sisi, we have So Fine, different beautiful names for our goats. And all of these goats respond to these names. Now, I argue that the goat possess positive nuances like wisdom. For instance, if you open a door in the presence of a goat, when you are not there, the goat tries to open the door again. It possesses resilience, it possesses doggedness, smartness, and the ability to cope with or contend with challenging situations. Now, I believe that these are positive values that we can communicate to children, that they should be resilient, they should not give up, like the goat does not give up. The goat is dogged. No matter how much you pursue it, the goat goes back until it gets what it wants. And the goat is able to challenge any situation. Children should not just be dogmatic and accept everything the way it is presented to them. They should query, they should ask questions so that we don't raise docile and insensitive children. And given the principle of reciprocity, the goat is capable of social learning from humans. So it means that we need to begin to optimize our behaviors. The negative vices that we know about the goat, there are also the negative vices that we know about ourselves. So it means that it is what is true of ourselves that we transfer to the goat. So it means that we should become better persons with positive values so that we can demonstrate this to animals and be able to appreciate their values and their relevance. So what I propose here is optimizing the Yoruba ethology of the goat towards better appreciation. And while discussing this paper recently with a friend in Germany, she's from Kenya, I just discussed the idea with her, and she told me that they have a different orientation about the goats in Kenya. For them, they believe that the goat is a smart animal, while the sheep is the stupid animal. So they tell children that you should be like the goat, you should be courageous, don't be a sheep. But on the other hand, in Yoruba society, they argue that children should be like sheep. So I see some twist to be gentle, that you should become so you should be like the sheep, don't interact with the dog, don't be a goat, and all of this, but it is the other way around in Kenya. And the Yoruba people also say, be a bojú wẹ̀yìn, that is, when the goat is pushed to the wall, when the goat will decide to look back and then retaliate. So it means that it is how we treat these animals that they treat us in return. They are capable of reciprocating the behaviors that we demonstrate to them. And so to have mutual relationship, to improve our understanding beyond the culinary and economic value, we need to change how we think about the goat and begin to demonstrate positive behaviors to them. Thank you.
Thank you. So, good day, everyone. Once again, my name is Sean Williams, and this is the title of my presentation, The Colonial Cattle, Diseases, and the Limits of Imperial Veterinary Science in Nigeria. So, and this is my outline. I will be skipping a bit of things because I want to maximize my time. Now, to begin with, I want to talk to us about, so this presentation is a section of my ongoing doctoral thesis. So a lot of information I may be passing here may be flattened out because I don't have the time to really expand on them. But really, from my engagement with the archival data that is available, the colonial Nigerian cattle can be characterized as a colonial subject, just like Said Adenrito has postulated in his recent book. So the Nigerian livestock during the era of colonialism in Nigeria were colonial subjects, just like humans, which meant that they were subjugated, they were oppressed, they were exploited, they were ordered, they were pathologized, they were policed, as much as the humans themselves were experienced this thing. And in fact, from the presentation of my two other colleagues here, we can also add that they were medicalized and they were even securitized. So, in essence, the lived realities of the Nigerian livestock under British colonial rule was not essentially different from the lived experiences of humans. Now, added to that, I also wanted to highlight the fact that in colonial Nigeria, the Nigerian livestock was also a livestock, which meant that they were commoditized bodies and they were imperial economic bodies. What that means goes back to the point about exploitation, economic exploitation. So livestock were seen as natural resources. They were seen as natural wealth. And these terms were really used in the archival data. The animals, cattle specifically, in colonial Nigeria was seen as an asset which the colonial government needed to maximally exploit. Understanding this characterization of the colonial cattle meant that in order to maximally exploit cattle, there were some hindrances that stood in the way. The major impediments that stood in the way of the colonial government maximizing its economic exploitation of the Nigerian cattle were epizootics, basically widespread diseases, epidemics. And during the early years of the advent of British colonization in Nigeria, there were three major epizootics that were raging across Nigeria. The first was rinderpest, and it was considered to be the most brutal. Next in line was this disease that I'm going to talk about here, contagious bovine pleuropneumonia. The third one being trypanosomiasis. These were considered to be the devastating trio of epizootics that decimated the large population of Nigerian cattle. In fact, as at the late 19th century, as at 1890, 1900s, 1910s, the population of Nigerian cattle was being estimated between 3 million and 5 million. But there were waves of epizootics, these kinds of diseases that I'm talking about, that were killing these animals in their thousands. So for the colonial state to be able to maximally exploit these animals, it had to find a solution. It has to find a way to suppress these diseases, because these diseases were basically wasting the animals away. So once the colonial government was able to arrest these diseases, it will be able to establish what I call in my project cattle capitalism. So, and that is why I'm going to talk about this disease today. So what really is contagious bovine pleuropneumonia, which you can call CBPP for short? It's also known as lung sickness. It is a highly contagious respiratory disease of cattle. It affects the more like the lungs of the animal, and it is caused by a bacteria known as Mycoplasma mycoides. The means of transmission is direct contact, and it is contacted through exhaled droplets in cough and sneeze. You can think of it more like the COVID, COVID in cattle. And it's also similar to COVID in the sense that it has a long incubation period, 3 to 6 weeks, which meant that between these 3 to 6 weeks, it is possible that it may not be detected, right? So, and the symptoms of the disease are also similar to COVID. It attacks the lungs and the pleura. It causes fever, causes rapid or difficult respiration. It produces cough and nasal discharges. And as I said earlier, there are asymptomatic forms, which are known as lungers. These asymptomatic forms are the forms in which the disease is present in the animal, but it cannot be detected through it is not visible. The animal is still living very fine, and it may not even be detectable. But the pathogens can be transmitted to other animals that come in contact with these lungers. Now, the CBPP is really severe and insidious, and this language insidious is used repetitively in the archival data, and I'll tell you why. The animal has a high morbidity, so it causes it wastes away the vitality of the animals. As you can see in this image, how shrunken this cow is, and then it causes also heavy mortality. Once it breaks out in a herd, it can kill as much as 90% or even 100% of all animals in a diseased herd. So, and then I want to highlight the fact that this particular disease has imperial origins. So the disease CBPP was not known in Africa until the 1850s. But back in the 16th century, it was already present in the Alpine and Pyrenean regions of Europe, basically Central Europe, around Switzerland, Germany, and those countries where you have the Alps and the Pyrenean Mountains. And by 1693, it was already recognized in Germany. Now, the person who is known as the father of modern veterinary science, Claude Bourgelat, described this disease back in 1765. It was only in 1898, over 100 years later, that the causal pathogen of the disease, which I mentioned earlier, it was only in 1898, I mean, at the end of the 19th century, that causal pathogen was discovered at the Louis Pasteur Institute. Now, between 1840 and 1860, there was already a panzootic of CBPP in Western Europe, in the region that I mentioned earlier, between Switzerland, Germany, and their neighboring countries. So there was already a pandemic of this disease between 1840 and 1860. Now, how did the disease get imported into Africa? So the Dutch colonialists in 1853 were trying to import Frisian bulls into South Africa. They were trying to do this because they thought that by crossbreeding these Frisian bulls from Netherlands with the local breeds of cattle, they will be able to increase the milk production, the milk yield of the indigenous cattle. And in the process of importing these Frisian bulls during a time where there was already a pandemic of CBPP in Western Europe, they imported pathogens of this disease into South Africa. And from its incursion in South Africa from 1853, there was, a South African epizootic of CBPP broke out between 1853 and 1857. And from South Africa, the disease began to spread from South Africa to Central Africa and into West Africa. Of course, it also spread into other parts of Africa, but my focus here is the Central Sudan, which is where we have Nigeria and West Africa. So by the late 19th century, so around 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, the disease spread to northeastern Nigeria. Now, I want to talk about this disease, CBPP in Nigeria. From its earliest incursion into Nigeria as at 1880s, by 1920, there was already, the disease had already become, there was already an epizootic of this disease, which was killing off animals in their hundreds of thousands in different parts of northern Nigeria. As at this time, there was nothing the colonial government or the colonial veterinary department could do, even though the veterinary department had been established as at 1913. But there was nothing it could do because there were only just about three veterinary staff in the whole of northern Nigeria, as expansive as it is. So the there were about 3 waves of epizootics of bovine pleuropneumonia in Nigeria up to the mid-1920s. And these waves, they subsided naturally, they died out naturally. But from the 1920s, arresting CBPP became the primary preoccupation of the colonial veterinary department. And CBPP was only ranked second to rinderpest. Rinderpest was considered to be the deadliest, but CBPP was considered to be the second deadliest livestock disease in Nigeria. But it was even more destructive than trypanosomiasis. The disease caused huge economic losses, and it threatened the colonial states' interest to establish an economy, livestock economy around cattle, around the immense population of cattle that Nigeria had. So the colonial state, the colonial government, the British colonial government in Nigeria, they dedicated immense resources and immense veterinary expertise towards suppressing bovine pleuropneumonia in Nigeria. And in the course of all of this, northern Nigeria became a living veterinary laboratory. To borrow the term of Ellen Tilly, northern Nigeria became a living veterinary laboratory in which veterinary science was being co-produced. So colonial veterinary veterinarians then in Nigeria in the early 20th century, they were not just importing veterinary science. They were not just importing veterinary science and introducing it into Nigeria, because they were also testing like I said, a lot about the disease remained unknown even until the mid 20th century. There were different questions about this disease that was not yet fixed as at that time. So issues such as the epidemiology of the disease, the etiology, and the treatment of the disease, they remained unclear even as at the 1940s. And in this map that you have here, even though it's not very clear, the map is showing different immunization centers that were established for suppressing rinderpest. But these same centers were also used for arresting bovine pleuropneumonia. Now, I want to talk about Fulani ethno-veterinary intervention in arresting CBPP. For the Fulani people, for the Fulani pastoralists, they thought of CBPP as even more deadly than rinderpest. While the colonial veterinarians considered rinderpest to be the most deadly livestock disease, the Fulani pastoralists considered CBPP to be even more serious. And then they feared it more than rinderpest. And then they developed their own native therapy for handling this disease, and it is known as dashing. The process involved the insertion of a pneumonic tissue. So they made a cut around the nasofrontal region of the cow. As you can see in these images, they made a cut and they inserted disease tissue, pneumonic tissue into that cut. And after doing that, of course, there was going to be swelling, and there was going to be pus. And they also tried to control this pain by making by searing the animal on the side with a hot iron. And when any animal that survives this process definitely became immune to some extent against the disease. Now, even though the Colonial Veterinary Department developed its own strategies, its own immunization policy for managing the disease, the Fulani pastoralists preferred their native therapy to the vaccination, to the colonial vaccination. But from the document, one thing stands out. The colonial veterinarians demonstrated their epistemic hubris, their arrogance, by describing the native therapy as crude, cruel, barbarous, and dangerous. Even though they recognized that the native intervention was effective to some extent. And now I'm going to talk about the colonials, the approaches that were developed through colonial science. For one, there were different problems with the colonial science interventions. One reason was the fact that it was impossible as at this time to conduct a definitive diagnosis of the disease. The disease was basically described as insidious because it was almost impossible to definitely diagnose the disease. The only way to definitely diagnose it was to kill the animal, which the Fulani pastoralists would not take lightly. They would definitely not agree to. So mass slaughter was the primary intervention that the colonial veterinarians could propose initially. And if they were to deploy this general slaughter policy, they had to develop some form of compensation. But considering how expansive northern Nigeria is, and considering the immensity, the large population of cattle that you had in northern Nigeria, it was impossible for the colonial government to come up with the resources by which they would compensate cattle headers for slaughtering any diseased heads, and they were slaughtering both suspects and diseased animals alike. So the policy was basically impracticable, but that was not all. They also came up with a quarantine policy, and the quarantine lasted 6 months because it took 6 months for Colonial veterinary science to be convinced that, okay, this particular herd, we can now say that this herd did not have the disease present in it. But it is impossible in the ecological circumstances in northern Nigeria to keep a herd in one spot for 6 months, because you had long droughts, long dry seasons in northern Nigeria, which meant that cattle herders had to move their herds from northern Nigeria to central Nigeria and some parts of southern Nigeria in order to procure grazing, pasture, and water. So, but the colonial veterinarians were proposing a quarantine policy that will require keeping the animal in one spot for 6 months. And this became problematic. So, added to that, the fact that vaccine development and vaccine deployment was terribly problematic. They developed different kinds of vaccines, which I will not be able to explain because for sake of time. They developed different kinds of vaccines, different kinds of permutations of application of these vaccines, different kinds of sites of application. As you can see in this image here, this is a colonial veterinarian applying the vaccine to the tail of this animal, which is a very problematic process because you have to pin down the animal, and which was done by cattle headers, native inoculators. You have to pin down the animal, you have to tie it down to be able to apply this. So there were several problems associated with the native, with the colonial vaccine that was introduced. But not only was the colonial vaccine problematic, but it was not very effective actually. So the various vaccines were tried, but they were either too potent, they were either too potent, yes, or they were not potent enough. So if they were too potent, they were causing severe swellings or fatalities. And if they were not potent enough, they were not adequate, they could not provide adequate immunity. On top of that, the department had serious staffing problems. So there was a dearth of personnel, dearth of resources. They had to rely heavily on native inoculators and indigenous laboratory and veterinary assistants. Then, so as a result of all of these complications and problems associated with the colonial vaccine and colonial veterinary intervention, the laboratory vaccine that was developed by the colonial veterinarians was completely unpopular among the Fulani pastoralists. And I'm going to contrast this with what happened in the case of rinderpest. In the case of rinderpest, the Fulani herders were actually storming the immunization camps to get their animals vaccinated. And in certain cases, they were even infecting their animals with rinderpest because they knew that once their animals were given the vaccine, the rinderpest vaccine, it gave permanent immunity, which meant that once a cow is vaccinated, it was permanently immune to rinderpest. But in the case of CBPP, the vaccine that was developed would only provide temporary immunity, at best 12 months. In most cases, it could only immunize the animal for about a period of about 6 months. So the Fulani had, which meant that you had to do re-immunization or revaccination. And the Fulani pastoralists didn't like this because it meant that they had to keep coming to the camp every so often to get the animals vaccinated. So all of this meant that the laboratory vaccine was totally unpopular. The reality was that while the Fulani herders were seeking the colonial veterinarians in order to get their animals. So while they were seeking the colonial veterinarians in order to get their animals vaccinated against rinderpest, they were hiding their herds away from the veterinarians. and applying their own native therapy. So overall, the story of colonial veterinary intervention against rinderpest was a brilliant success. But in the case of CBPP, it was a massive failure. And you can see it in all of these quotations that I have here from the chief veterinary officer regarding the native vaccine. And I would show another one regarding the laboratory vaccine later. I will just read this one of these quotations where the chief veterinary officer said that the native method of inoculation tends to curtail an outbreak, and that fact is undoubted. And this is being confirmed by the CBO. But on account of the septic conditions, the pus that it causes, under which it is carried out, many deaths occurred. But of course, using the laboratory vaccine, many deaths occurred as well. So all of these realities made one senior veterinary officer then to assert that the veterinarians, the colonial veterinarians, had not achieved anything better than the local cow doctors. So it was interesting to me that a senior veterinary officer could call Fulani herders as local cow doctors, basically as local veterinarians. So my argument in all of this is really that local cattle producers, Fulani herders, were pragmatic and eclectic in choosing which colonial veterinary intervention they were going to adopt or reject. And then we can see colonial epistemic hubris and the limits of colonial science in all of this episode. And we can also see that colonial veterinary science was not epistemic transfer. It was not a transfer of knowledge, basically. It was a case of co-production and co-construction of knowledge, of science, by expatriates and local experts. So the colonial veterinarians were experts, they were expatriate experts, while the Fulani cattle producers were also local experts in their own right. They were developing ethno-veterinary interventions in managing diseases. And overall, Africa, in this case, northern Nigeria, became a living veterinary laboratory. Thank you. So, yeah, I'm going to stop the share now, and we can have questions, comments, and contributions from the house. I can see two hands in the house already, and I'll just pass it.
Okay, so good afternoon. I have a question for the presenter on the goats and so she was saying something about animals using the like what in literature we call it the metaphor of the goats as a kind of what humans can infer from their behavior, to improve their own behavior. So my question is, why do we, and she made a comment that animals are capable of social learnings from humans. Why must animals learn from humans? Why can't animals be animals and humans humans? Does that not bring the issue of hegemony, or what others call hegemony, and the issue of speciesism, where humans have this ideology of superiority? So why can't animals be animals and humans humans? Why must animals learn from humans? For the last presenter, I don't know if you have read Jeff Perez, The Dead Will Rise. The Dead Will Rise. You should look at that text. It talks about the cattle killing, the Zosa cattle killing movement of the 1850s. Jeff Perez, The Dead Will Arise. And that work was also dramatized in Zach's and that's Heart of Redness. So that may also be very helpful. So again, my question is the place of the Fulani, what I call it therapy. What is the place of animal suffering? And of course, you mentioned
Animal
it.
suffering.
Yes, animal suffering and torture in the therapy of the Fulani against the cattle disease. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll grab a second hand here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm directing my first comment to the last presenter. Of course, you said the background that your work is ongoing and it's the derivative of your PhD thesis. I will have had a problem with situating your work within disciplinary boundary. Because as you are talking, one may want to think that you are in maybe health science, veterinary medicine, and maybe the work is from a historical perspective. But since it's an aspect of your thesis, it's understandable. I want to address this comment to the person that presented on goats. Of course, your presentation has validity because the general narrative is to look at the negative attributes of goats. But what I'm trying to say in your work is that we can also look at the positive attribute of goats. But there's an aspect of goat, a character of attribute of goat that I want you to include, and that's the capacity for regurgitation. A goat gets to a place, maybe they put beans, the goats, eat the beans as fast as possible and store it. So when you get to a very quiet place, start regurgitating and chewing it properly for digestion. That has a lot of meaning. Because of time, I will not be able to expand more on that, but it's very, very important because it's very cogent. It's key when you interpret it and bring out lessons. Now, the third thing, is that I want to direct this to who is Todo.
Yeah.
Now, when you assess the information from Igala archives, you just told us that the file was empty. What effort did you make to inquire why that file was empty and what has been the response of the archivist to get information that have been lost through that file? Because that is major. Did you make further investigation, or are you curious to know why?
There's another hand here.
Hi. Sorry, I'm not into animals, but it's not into the study of animals, but it's very interesting as I listen to all the presenters, especially the one on goats. I feel a much understanding on how animals is being represented to us, especially in the southern parts. We watch a lot of movies, and for me, I feel that this kind of movies and folktales also helps us furthermore on the representation of goat. For instance, anytime growing up, my mom is always saying goat is Emon Yashogo. So anywhere I see goat, even the eating of it, I run away. Emon Yashogo is a movie of witches. So when we say goat, I call them witches because of those images which we saw from films that really helps our understanding. And that does not only deal with goats. It deals with other animals like a cat. Going to Europe and saying cat to someone's house, I run away from it. So this is just our understanding. How do your literature helps Yorubas especially to have a better, more understanding of and representation of animals. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more hands? Okay. Yeah.
Okay, thanks to all of the speakers. This was a really rich panel. I've got a quick question for Catherine. I'll be very quick. Catherine, thanks for that talk. I was just wondering how the pre-colonial, in inverted commas, context shaped the histories you discussed? You know, what was the kind of context in which these colonial interventions were intervening, and how did that shape or not shape the later colonial policies?
Okay. So I will take the advantage to just add a brief question for my co-presenter here. I'm just curious to know, what was the inspiration behind this project? Is it because your parents, your mom also had goals, and yeah, and then are you thinking towards composing, allegories and folk poems like that would counterbalance the one you recited to us? Because of course, this folk poem, I believe, must have been composed by the first generation of Yoruba authors, the likes of Dio Fagunwas and the likes of them. I cannot specifically say who it was, but if we made some research, we would definitely know who composed it. And are you also thinking of composing similar folk poems and trying to popularize them as a way of, the popularization of knowledge that you are trying to produce here?
Okay. Thank you very much for the beautiful questions and comments. I really appreciate it. Starting with the first question, that why must animals learn from humans? Now, I would try to attend. This is an ongoing work, and I would look at the question from a Western perspective that distinguishes between humans and other more than humans. Now, that perspective does not exist in African philosophy, in African understanding. All forms of beings are interconnected. And that is why Placide Tempels argues that the ontological basis of existence in African philosophy is the vital force. Now, the vital force for him is an energy that permeates all beings. That is why you find a form of animal in humans, you find it in plants. There's something that interconnects us, and he calls it the vital force. It is like a spiritual energy. That is why in the hierarchy of being, there is no distinction, unlike what we have in Western orientation. But in Africa, the environment is one. And when I say the environment, it does not exclude any being, it includes humans. So there is no distinction. The relationship is mutual, it is reciprocatory. Humans benefit animals, animals benefit humans, plants, and all other forms of beings. So we learn from each other. Not that animals must necessarily learn from humans. Humans to learn from animals because of the interconnection. There is no distinction at all. So we should try to de-emphasize such Western baggages. And I will also try to look at it in the work. And then the capacity for regurgitation is something I will look at. I've read some works on it, and I'll look at it. And then how goats is represented, especially the spiritual aspect of Eraya Shubu. When that movie was released, I was afraid of goats myself, and so we need better understanding of the goats, and that is what I intend to begin to do in this research. And now the inspiration for this work was when I went to Germany in 2023, and I saw a garden, like a home for a goat. It's so like an hectare of land for 2 goats. And the goats are well behaved. We go to greet the goats. We take pictures. I could not find the pictures. We take pictures with the goats, and sometimes when they feel that you are coming to, maybe attack them, they run, they try to. So I was now like, okay, if that means it is possible to rear goats and make them responsible when you give them enough space. And the Yoruba people also argue that goats should not be caged. Now, I saw that in Germany, goats can actually be caged. And how you cage the goat is that you give it enough space, enough green land, enough green space. And in Africa, we believe that there's a particular plant that the goat eats, such that the goat will be able to give birth. by itself. So I was now thinking, why can't we have a large space like this for goats, where we can plant those vegetables for them to eat, for them to survive. So the inspiration came when I went to Germany and I saw a different way of rearing goats and the way the goats are cherished and all of that. And then about composing better allegories, I've been thinking about it after we looked at the folklore that I presented. I've been thinking about it that we need to begin to recompose more allegories, and this will not be limited to myself alone. We can have scholars from literature, scholars from music coming together to do all of this. Thank you very much.
Okay. We should be rounding up shortly, but does Catherine or Itodo want to make any interventions? Yeah, you want to say something? Okay, continue, please.
Yes. I didn't get most of the part because of what he said about my work, because of the
question was really
network issues.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Catherine, can you jump in, please?
Yeah.
Yes.
Italy, you're back. Go ahead.
Hello? Yes. Hello?
Okay. Yes. So the question was about the empty file. The file that you saw that was empty. You said you saw a file and it was empty. So the attendee was asking, what did you do to try and find out what had happened and how you may be able to find the file from other sources, something like that.
Okay. Although the file in the archive is empty, but there are few books that I've written on it using the same file, and I tried to meet the family of the late Atta, because what I said about that was that the file regarding to the deposition of the Atta that insisted that the Ocho must take the Ocho, either he's alive or not. So that particular file is empty, but somebody like Peter Okoli has written something on the history of Igala culture. So he used some part of the some documents from the file which actually relate to my work, and I'm still in touch with the archivist. And I've gone to the immediate family and the royal house to get information, of which some I have gotten and some they still promised. So with time, I think I'll be able to get the necessary information to put the work through.
Maybe if it's also possible for you, probably personally or through any of your contacts. Catherine, I think you can jump in.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for that question. So, as I alluded to, the livestock was used as a way of managing different kinds of political affiliations and relationships, as well, and looting was also kind of part of, in a sense, mutual policing of borders. But those borders, I suppose, are around like political borders that are constructed differently in a kind of pre-colonial period. They're not necessarily borders that are clearly defined geographically, but they're more about rights. So rights to grazing, rights to water resources, and in a sense also, as I say, about kind of political affiliation. But even before the British established the Protectorate in 1887, the Horn of Africa, and particularly that kind of region of Somaliland and kind of Somalia, was hugely important for the production of livestock that then fed into the Saudi Peninsula, and the British were bought a lot of the goat and sheep meat from that region to support the British Army, the kind of the army from British India that was stationed in Aden. So yeah, there's a kind of longer prehistory of colonial interaction, but also a different kind of history of how livestock was used to mediate political borders that weren't necessarily set.
Okay, and so I got the question about animal suffering and animal torture. I mean, the easiest way I can answer that is whatever the Fulani did, insofar as it has the possibility of giving some therapy, it is better than leaving the animal to die by CBPP, you know, because I mean, this disease has a very high mortality rate of about 90%. So if this veterinary intervention, this ethno-veterinary intervention is applied, and it gives some level of immunity or healing, it's far better than death, than sure death. And in any case, yes, because I mean, from the colonial records themselves, the veterinary officers.
I mean, if you think the death, because from the angle philosophically, you think that something is better than death, but that's an aside.
I mean, yeah, because even the intervention by the colonial veterinarians involved serious pain too, serious pain, swelling, death. So I mean, it's not any better. But if there is an intervention that can help you suppress the disease, and I believe it's far better than short death, really. So thank you, everyone. We have to yield the space now for the next panel to begin. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.